12,500 residents who applied for the Emergency Household Support Fund, the children that turn up to school hungry, families that rely on food banks and free school meals. We all know them. Some will already be included in the protected characteristics and some will not. But we absolutely know that our residents across the whole of the county are facing hardships, stress, ill health, higher crime rates, lower educational achievement, lower paying jobs, isolation, oppression, marginalisation, and the list could go on and on because of poverty and ingrained social economic inequalities. We have to make fundamental cultural shifts to shield and support our most vulnerable residents and actively consider the way in which our policies and strategic decisions can increase or decrease inequalities. And we can. The public sector duty regarding socio-economic inequalities, that's Section 1 of the Equality Act 2010, has not been legislated. Successive governments since 2010 have failed to commence it, which means that public authorities are not technically bound by it. And yet adopting it as a council would be an incredibly powerful tool to help us address and reduce social economic inequalities in our communities. The duty states this: an authority to which this section applies must, when making decisions of a strategic nature about how to exercise its functions, have due regard to the desirability of exercising them in a way that is designed to reduce the inequalities of outcome which result from socio-economic disadvantage. 14% of people in Finland are living in poverty. Cambridge is the most unequal city in the UK. The pandemic further exposed inequalities in our communities. National data showed how it disproportionately affected people who are Black, Asian, or come from another minority ethnic background, disabled people, and those who are living with a long-term health condition. Local data provided by Cambridgeshire Insight showed it disproportionately impacting those who live in care homes, homes with communal living between households, those who live in high occupancy homes, and our residents on the lowest incomes. Adapting our equality impact assessment tools and processes and reviewing and sharing the data that we have about social economic inequality across the county would provide clearer information to staff on what we want them to consider when using the equality impact assessment to support their work. It will also help to identify people belonging to more than one equality strand and the impact of intersectionality, which becomes increasingly complex to decipher and address. It will give more nuance when considering aspects covered by the policy priority areas of rural isolation, poverty and deprivation, and enable overlapping these concepts with each other and with health inequalities. It would also mean that the needs of people who have been homeless, have been in care, have a military service background, or are ex-offenders, for example, can be considered without needing to crowbar these experiences in under one of the protected characteristics to justify it. Passing this motion and adopting the social economic duty would support inclusive approaches to strategic decision-making across the council, reducing the most pressing inequalities of outcome exacerbated by the pandemic, the cost of living crisis, and ingrained social economic inequality. It would ensure that the council's decision-making does not only take full account of social economic disadvantage, but that it is guided and shaped by the recognition, complexities, needs, and care of our residents that live in rural isolation, poverty, and deprivation. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have a seconder for that motion? Councillor Sanderson.
Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to second and I reserve my right to speak. Thank you.
So we have an amendment on this motion from Councillor Camp. Would you like to move your amendment, Councillor Camp?
Yes, thank you, Chair. This is a fairly simple amendment that I hope is well received. The Equality Act 2010, largely enacted, helps all of us strive towards a more just and fairer society, which is to be welcomed. Councillor Hilary Cox-Condren wishes to pursue improvements by adopting the unenacted Part 1, which by and large looks at disparities through an additional socio-economic lens. I support and welcome the addressing of inequalities and feel that it is an embodiment of what we as councillors and our officers strive to achieve as a natural part of our DNA. I'm sure all members primarily agree on the outcomes to reducing inequalities. Unfortunately, we cannot always agree on the route map of how to get there. Upon reading the motion, I was struck by and understood the socio-economic lens and the purpose behind it, and felt that it may be aided by additional, more recent material which is contained within the Commission on Racial and Ethnic Disparities report. For example, the 2010 duty leads us to a definition of socio-economic disadvantage, which is living in less favourable societal and or economic circumstances than others in the same society. And the latter report has caused us to look specifically at areas such as Grenfell because of the tragedy that occurred there. It is easy as a layperson to see not just a question of race or ethnicity covered in my additional recommendation, but also of living in areas of socio-economic disadvantage compared to other areas of the same society covered in the original motion. It is for reasons such as this I believe the amendment is beneficial. It is also important for us to recognise that we cannot ever really achieve our aims to reduce inequality if we fail to address the very real ethnic and racial disparity that continues to exist in our society. I feel that there are many layers to these complicated questions, and whilst the 2010 duty provides some direction, it is important that this Council continues to update its thinking as well as other more recent thinking develops. I hope this simple amendment is accepted in the view of the additional benefit it is supposed to bring. Thank you, Chair.
Do you have a seconder for that amendment?
Happy to second and reserve my right to speak.
Thank you, Councillor Bowden. Councillor Cox-Condren and Councillor Sanderson, do you accept that amendment or do we need to debate it? Councillor Cox-Condren?
I'm not accepting the amendment. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to move on to the debate on the amendment, whether that amendment becomes a substantive motion. So would anybody like to speak in this debate? Councillor Dupre?
Thank you, Chair. I will speak mercifully briefly to make just one observation, and that is that while Councillor Count's amendment is not actively destructive, neither does it contribute anything of real substance to this motion, which is really about something else entirely, and for that reason I encourage members to vote against it.
Councillor Netzinger?
I'll also be very brief. The report referred to in the commission who wrote this report was recruited by the then advisor to the Prime Minister, Munira Mirza, who famously denied the existence of structural and institutional racism. One of the commissioners, Samuel Kasuma, resigned shortly after this report was published. The report was condemned by the Bishop of Dover, Rose Hudson Wilkinson, as deeply disturbing, and by David Olusoga as appearing to prefer to sweep history under the carpet. Boris Johnson, when setting up the commission, said explicitly that he wanted to change the narrative so that we stop the sense of victimisation. The report was referred to as deeply disappointing and a missed opportunity by Labour and the Liberal Democrats, and as a deliberate attempt to whitewash racism by the Green Party. And it has been ignored by the government since its publication. I am keen that we discuss issues of inequality here in Cambridgeshire, and I'm also keen that we consider how to tackle issues of race and ethnic diversity. But let us do that properly with a well-thought-through motion on that topic, and not by shoehorning a poorly received government report into Hillary's excellent motion. So I would ask you to vote down this amendment.
Councillor Hoy?
Yeah, I'm just a bit confused as to why you would just not want to. All it's saying is review the report at the committee. So you could review the report at the committee and say all the things you've just said, and say if you think it's rubbish, this is a load of rubbish, we don't support it. We're not kind of committing anyone to anything other than review, so it just seems a bit trivial really to kind of be against something that you could get rid of anyway if you didn't support.
Councillor Tierney?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I'm not really against the amendment or the original motion. I think both raise good points. But I did find it interesting that Cambridge City, the city which has been overly controlled and dominated by left-leaning parties forever, MPs, councils, is the most unequal city in the country. And I would propose there might be some connection. Thank you.
Don't see any other hands, so I think we're going to move to Councillor Bowden as seconder of the amendment.
Thank you very much, Chair. This is a very straightforward amendment, but it recognises a complexity. And the complexity it recognises is the way in which inequality is expressed in a whole host of different ways and through a whole host of different measurements. Ethnicity is most definitely an element within that which needs to be taken into account. And Councillor Hoy was entirely correct. This amendment doesn't compel the Council to do anything, but gives us the opportunity to review the report and take from the report what is helpful. So I think that this amendment really is one which we should be supporting. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Cox-Condren, would you like to sum up before we move to the vote?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I agree that intersectionality is an incredibly important and complex issue, and I'd be happy to review the report and to listen to another motion, and I'm interested in what Councillor Count had to say about that. However, it is not relevant to this motion. If anything, it's a distraction from the purpose of the motion, which is to adopt the socio-economic inequalities duty so that any decision that the Council makes does not disproportionately advantage our residents who are living in poverty. The Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities is primarily focused on one of the already protected characteristics, race, and protected characteristics are already part of the legislation, whereas social economic inequalities duty is an aspect of the equalities race that has not been adopted into legislation. The social economic duty relates to everyone, residents with all protected characteristics and none, and will benefit all people on low incomes. So adopting this duty in Council would complement and strengthen our existing commitment and activity around all protected characteristics. So to reiterate, there is no need to separate just one of these protected characteristics and the other 8 were not pulled out. They are already covered under the Equalities Act 2010. The purpose of the motion is to get the socio-economic duty adopted, which is currently not covered. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, so we're going to move to the vote then. We're voting on whether Councillor Count's amendment becomes a substantive motion. So all those in favour, please raise your hand now. All those against? Any abstentions, please?
Chair, the result of the vote is 22 votes in favour, 32 against and 1 abstention. The amendment is therefore lost.
So now we're going to move on to debate on Councillor Cox-Condren's original motion. Councillor Hoy.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I hope this motion isn't just words and is actually actions. Just a few moments ago when Councillor Tierney said about Cambridge being the most unequal city, the Vice Chairman muttered about Wisbech. Well, actually, Wisbech doesn't have as vast, although it has high levels of deprivation, it doesn't have as vast a gap between the richest and the poorest, actually, within the town. But I was really glad you mentioned it because it allowed me to kind of bring in this point about it being needs to be actions and not just words. Because we often talk and hear a lot of virtue signalling about caring about the poorest in our society and those most in need. But every time decisions are made, they don't follow that. So take the last Children and Young People's Committee as a prime example, when you have all the statistics telling you that at least double, nearly 3 times as many children with special educational needs in Finland need a special school, and they aren't getting it. And compared to the rest of the county, they're being bused to Huntingdon in an hour's taxi ride just to attend a school. And we aren't building one. We're saying we need to build a new school in Finland. It's clear, the evidence is there. We have less special schools. Every other district has 2 or more special schools. Finland only has 1. Finland children clearly need it, and we're told, no, sorry, we can't. We're not going to do that. So it kind of feels to me that there's a lot of fancy words about how much we care about poor people and people that are most in need. I just hope that we actually see some action on that.
Councillor Bowden.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to be enthusiastically supporting this motion with only one proviso, and that is very much along the lines of what Councillor Hoy has just said. If we look at the measurements of deprivation, particularly at lower super output area, I'll call it LSOA from now on rather than lower super output area. If we look at the LSOA data in the indices of multiple deprivation, we find that all of the LSOAs which are most deprived in this county are all in the north of the county. They are all in Fenland. Now, what I would expect to see, Chair, as a result of this motion being passed, is that there would be a recognition of that fact along the lines, not merely in education, as Councillor Hoy was saying, but in other areas as well, which this council's got responsibility for, to be able to help redress that inequality that exists on a north-south basis within the county. Now, I fully accept that there are areas outside Fenland which also have lower amounts of deprivation than the neighbouring areas, and particularly within Cambridge, we do know that there are some areas which have quite high levels of deprivation, but they are not as high as we see within Fenland. So I am expecting this motion to pass with a very large majority. I enthusiastically support it, but what I will also enthusiastically expect is that this is followed up by actual action in future work which is done on the strategic side, because, to be quite honest, I've seen no sign of it yet. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Bradnam, please.
Thank you, Chair. I speak as the Chair of the Corporate Parenting Subcommittee, and I remind us all here today that each one of us is a corporate parent to the children in care from Cambridgeshire, whether those young people are living here in the county or elsewhere. Looking after and protecting children and young people is one of the most important jobs that councils do. And when a child, for whatever reason, can't safely stay at home, it's up to us as the local authority to step in and give them care, support and the stability that they deserve. This means all of us for all of them, whatever their age, while they are in our care, whatever their ability or disability, their gender or gender preference, whatever their race, religion or belief, their sex or sexual orientation, they are all our children and young people. And all of these characteristics are covered by the original Act. So we need to be open-minded and supportive and accepting of their needs and preferences, including their socio-economic disadvantage that might have contributed to their original vulnerability. We need to support and accept their needs and preferences, mindful that our language and planning could inadvertently isolate, exclude or judge. So I want to heartily endorse Councillor Cox-Condren's motion, which reminds us of our duty to think about all of our young people in the way we speak and write, taking account of our most vulnerable children and young people, supporting them to live meaningful and fulfilling lives, whatever they choose their lives to be, and taking into account whatever source of disadvantage they have lived up to the point at which they became cared for by us, and including poverty. So this motion reminds us that it's our duty to take into account all the inequalities that some children and young people in care have already experienced, and to aim to reduce those inequalities in our strategic thinking to enable our children and young people to be themselves and live their best lives. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Thompson.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me okay? As referred to in Councillor Cox-Condren's motion, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed inequalities in our communities, and the only way to start breaking through these barriers is to be strategically looking at our data and insights to reach out and help struggling residents to promote equality and inclusion through fair and accessible county services. Cambridgeshire Insights has earnings from the Office of National Statistics, and also, and most importantly, the Index of Multiple Deprivation ranks every lower super output area, LSOA, in England and Wales. This is the official measure of relative deprivation for small areas or neighbourhoods in England, and covers areas of income, employment, education, health, crime, barriers to housing and services, and living environment, and also going into further breakdown into fuel poverty, children living in low-income families, and homelessness in priority need. The above, plus our own data from children and young people in education, provides insight into educational attainment in Cambridgeshire at county level, which also includes the free school meals programme. In some cases, we continue to bump up against the requirements of GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. This includes to be a frustration for both ourselves and our partners. We are working with partners on an issue-by-issue basis, and more than ever, we need to be thinking about how we ask for consent to allow us to offer services across our departments and our organisations. We also do not want the fixation of data transfer to stop us following the most intuitive routes. For example, we cannot currently access lists of people who are in council tax areas to offer them support, but district councils can do that. This is an approach we took with one district to publicise the Household Support Fund recently. These are crucial insights to be truly inclusive. We need to keep working with our district partners, volunteer sectors and the community to tackle the disadvantages more efficiently and coherently. Thank you.
Councillor Tierney.
Thank you, Chairman. Just to respond to a couple of points in the debate, I think it's fair to say that it's right that the COVID-19 pandemic shone a light on inequalities in the country. The wealthy were able to sit safely at home, keeping their jobs in a nice luxury home office, while the working class ran around delivering them food and delivering the essential services that kept the country running. So yes, absolutely, there was a light shined. I'll be supporting this motion because I believe in treating people fairly and equally and democratically. I think everyone should be treated respectfully, even though there are some wording in there that concerns me a little. But I would like to just ask people to wonder, why do we need to have motions that set duties and policies? If we're in charge of the council, we should be delivering those duties and policies. You know, I don't get up in the morning and write myself a list of things I must do in the day because it's me that must do them. And so it's great to have duties assigned to the council if you're going to stick to them. Not just stick to them with your own ideological lens, but thinking more widely. And I would suggest one way that you could alleviate some of the inequalities of the country is by not raising council tax every year by the maximum you can. Thank you.
Councillor Howitt.
Thank you, Chair. I welcome this resolution. I congratulate Councillor Cox-Condren and Councillor Sanderson, not just for the resolution, but for the work they're doing in the Community's Social Mobility and Inclusion Committee. Social mobility, inclusion and our efforts to combat poverty must be a hallmark of our administration, alongside our commitment to environmental sustainability and the fight against climate change. And the fact that we heard earlier that we employ 3 times more women than men in this council, but pay women 10% less, shows that equality is an issue. I'm grateful for what the resolution says about COVID, our efforts on COVID with black and minority ethnic communities, the efforts of our officers, health partners, community groups and volunteers to put out information about COVID in different languages, to recruit champions amongst minorities, and to take our mobile vaccination centres to areas known for their minority ethnic communities. COVID-19 has increased pre-existing inequalities, with 40% of excess deaths in the most deprived tenth of the population compared to the more prosperous. And it illustrates that poverty is a cause of ill health, not just a consequence. We should note, as opposition members have said, that there are areas of deprivation in our county where poverty must be tackled. We should all agree with that. But this is not just an issue of where you live, but what life and life chances you have. And for those in poverty in Cambridge, the lowest 20% of the population account for just 2% of the income earned. And as the resolution says, this is a socio-economic issue. When I listened to the Conservatives earlier in the debate praise the Conservative race report, which Black Lives Matter said whitewashes the daily challenges faced by black and minoritised communities, to reflect the earlier debate, Stanley Baldwin and Benjamin Disraeli would be turning in their graves. Chair, this motion applies to every service and every committee of the Council. Like some others in the debate, I think that when we debate motions, they don't always lead to change within the Council itself, and I'm glad that that's been called for across the hall. I hope the senior management team of the Council will look at this motion, if passed, and determine what will change because of it. It is about where and what we charge for our services, how we make our services more accessible to those who need them most, and where decisions we take in allocating resources may inadvertently widen rather than reduce inequality. The motion is clear, disadvantage to be subject to impact assessments and to other evidence to be brought before us. And as members, that means we have to make a commitment to take note of that evidence when we make difficult decisions in our committees. Finally, the equalities duty is absolutely crucial for better protection of all people according to the protected characteristics, race, gender, disability, sexual orientation and identity and other characteristics. Our motivation in bringing this resolution is to say that many of these groups are subject to double or multiple discrimination as victims of poor education, poverty pay, hunger and inadequate housing. This council is one which will combat discrimination and poverty together.
Councillor Slatter.
Thank you, Chair. I want to particularly speak in support of Resolution B, the impact of our policies and practices on residents with protected characteristics, especially disabilities. And here this is partly to learn from what we've done in the past, to acknowledge it takes a long time, but to illustrate that we do put things into practice. Soon after the Disability Discrimination Act became law, I was elected to the City Council and combined my councillor duties with nursing young adults with physical disabilities, particularly spinal injuries, MS and motor neuron disease. As a result of this double life, I worked in partnership with our access officer to develop the Disability Consultative Panel, which brought together people with a range of disabilities to consider planning applications. We also invented and introduced the Way to Be Awards, which considered nominations of local businesses and services who had made particular efforts to understand, accommodate and help customers and clients with disabilities. Such personal stories get into the press, they encourage others, and something I know we also do in other areas. The panel still meets, but I'm told there is much less work for it to do because there is much more understanding and acceptance